Chapter 33. America was absolutely miserable. Millions of men were out of work, banks were failing, homes were being repossessed, factories were being closed, and my skin was breaking out. Everyone wanted to know what President Hoover was going to do about it. As it turned out, Hoover didn't have the answers. Surprisingly enough, neither did Papa. He spent more time in the steam bath, saying that it not only took the poisons out of his system, it also soothed his worries about his business. He often talked to Mama about his company's trouble, mortgage failures, repossessions, and other gloomy things. Mama was having worries too. One day when I brought a letter in from the mailbox, I looked at the postmark, Atlanta, Georgia. I was puzzled. Who do we know in Atlanta? My father, Mama said, with a sadness in her voice. I wanted to ask more, but I felt checked. That night, however, I heard her talking to Papa while he was in the steam bath. He keeps asking for my forgiveness, but I just can't find it in my heart. Papa answered, Well, please find it in your heart to undo the latch so I can get out. Mama said, Someday you're going to get caught in there, and no one will be here to spring you. I know, I've got to fix the latch, Papa admitted. Remind me the next time I go to the hardware store. The whole issue of my skin breaking out upset Mama's time schedule. She had prepared Flor for puberty, not only telling her about the birds and bees, but also having her sign up for zoology at school. Unfortunately, I turned out to be the early bloomer. Maybe that was because I was taking music. It was not that we three little Bighams didn't know anything about the facts of life. Mama probably taught us more along these lines than most women of the day. After all, she considered herself liberated. Her lessons were often in the form of a demonstration, using what was at hand. I can see her now, butcher knife in hand, a chicken in the other. In those days, chickens came with a head on one end and 2 feet on the other. Cutting up the bird was a struggle for Mama. She reminded us that, when she was young, she had a Nancy to do it for her. We know, Mama, we know. As she wrestled out the innards, she identified the parts. We picked them up and examined them. The heart and lungs, and a fearsome little sac which, if cut or squeezed, would spread its bitter bile through the whole chicken, or maybe the whole world for that matter. She cut into the dense, muscular walls of the gizzard, scraping out the little rocks, and explaining how they helped to grind up the feed. She said that if chickens weren't given grit, they would all drop over dead. Then, she pulled out the reproductive cells, which ranged from little yellow specks to carton size. She explained how they were sluiced down the pipeline and out the... Here, Mama paused, figuring there was no use complicating our vocabulary with words a lady wouldn't ever have the occasion to use. Florence, the expert, filled the gap. They come out the thingamabob. After my skin broke out, Mama took education one step further. She closed the bedroom curtains and, among other things, answered the question I had been wondering about since the butcher lessons. No, girls don't lay eggs like chickens, but... With that, she gave me a sketchy lesson on reproduction and ended with, But don't tell Dorothy, she's too young. That's exactly where I was headed. I found Dorothy in her usual spot, standing over the heat register in the front room. We had had a bad load of sawdust that year, more ants than sawdust. Papa had protested to the fuel company. From the smell of burning flesh, I don't know if it's the ants in the hopper or the females of my household standing on the heat registers. I squeezed in beside Dor. I didn't tell her everything. I just barely introduced the subject. I'm a big girl now, and it isn't just because I've grown 2 inches in the last 6 months. Dor said, I know you're big. You take up the whole heat register. I ignored that. Mama says that now that I'm big, I can have a baby. Dorothy was bowled over. She wanted to know more, but I said, Mama said I shouldn't tell you. Just what Dor needed. If you don't tell me, I'm going to tell her you told me all about babies. Thus it was that at the tender age of 10, Dorothy learned the facts of life. The next morning at breakfast, she asked Papa, How would you like us to cook your reproductive cells? If Mama had known that Flor and I would have an adventure from which we would learn more facts of life than either she or Hoover were willing to supply, she probably wouldn't have spent so much time on our education. On second thought, she wouldn't have allowed us to participate in the adventure in the first place. Whose idea it was that Flor and I work in the berry fields, I'm not sure. Although at the time, we were bent on showing Papa that if he wasn't going to provide for us adequately, we were capable of providing for ourselves. Papa called it lack of management. We called it a lack of money. On the other hand, Papa may have come up with the idea. He was tired of hearing, Everybody gets more allowance than we do. Mama wasn't keen on the idea because of the bums and degenerates who haunted the fields, but she finally agreed that if Flora and I could get friends to accompany us, we could go. There's safety in numbers, she consoled herself. It wasn't easy. Everyone we knew had better things to do: swimming, parties, sleeping late in the morning, etc. Finally, we were approached by two sisters, Nell and Belle, who were fairly new to the neighborhood. They had heard about our proposition and were excited to go with us. We were not so excited. We had conflicting feelings towards Nell and Belle. At our first acquaintance, we had actually considered asking them to be our best friends. We had thought of them as adventuresome and gung-ho for anything. That was before we had become aware of their true identity. Our awareness arrived one day when we were playing Old Maid with them in our front room. When Papa came home, we introduced them, and as Papa was wont to do, he engaged them in a conversation. "What does your father do?" I didn't understand their answer, but when I glanced up, I noticed that Papa had turned pale. Instead of settling in his chair to read the paper, he headed for the basement. It sounded like he was shutting up cupboards. At dinner, Papa said kind of offhand, "I hope you haven't told your friends about my activities." Gosh, no. We knew better than that. Mama was always warning us to be discreet, which meant that we didn't discuss the activities of our household with outsiders. Papa explained that their father was a dry agent. Gosh, what's a dry agent? Mama knew. One whose job it is to put people in jail who make homebrew, especially lawyers. This was probably the first time I had heard the penalty spelled out. I realized that jail might include Flora and me. By this time, we were actually implicated in the process. At first, it was simply carrying bottles up and down the stairs. Our route covered considerable distance, from the little basement room to the place near the back door, where the oak ice chest stood. There were any number of hazards along the way, including the telephone cord, but the biggest trap was the door at the top of the stairs, where Papa had installed a heavy spring to keep the door closed. With our hands full of bottles, we could never negotiate the hazard without getting a good bang on the rear. It was not uncommon to have bottles flying off into space, and on some occasions, us. Mama complained almost as much as we did. She hated having broken glass and sticky beer showering down on her while she was sitting at the mangle, ironing Papa's white shirts, to say nothing of having to watch our bodies tumbling down the stairs. In answer to her complaints, Papa made us a heavy carrier which held 6 bottles. Of course, we complained that it was adding to the female problems we were already suffering from, shoveling sawdust and docking our boat. In time, Papa added to our chores. The bottling had to be done at a specific time, and if he was on a trip or his gout was acting up, someone else had to do it. It ended up being either Flora or me. The siphoning of the raw beer into the bottles seemed fairly simple when Papa did it, but when I was alone, sitting on the old chopping block, which was unsteady, due in part to the unevenness of the concrete floor, there was no end of problems. I was terrified of being alone in the dark, damp room that reeked of green beer, paralyzed by the fear of spiders, bugs, loathsome creatures that hide away in the cracks in the concrete, or big, beady-eyed rats who had become too clever to be caught in Papa's strategically placed rat traps. I was continually haunted by apparitions of ice cream ghosts, Chinese bootleggers, and dry agents. If I didn't suck in enough of the awful tasting stuff, I couldn't get the flow going. If I did manage and wasn't watchful, the tub would slip out of the copper kettle and stop the flow. Sometimes the level of beer in the kettle would lower, stopping the flow again. All the while, I had to be careful not to let the hose get down into the bottom of the kettle and draw the sediment into the bottles. I never seemed to get the siphoning job done without making a mess and breaking down in hysterics. Every moment I spent there, my resentment toward Papa grew. Papa was such a stickler about rules. He lived by the rules. He probably never exceeded the speed limit. He would have rowed across the Potomac to return a penny. Even so, he was involved in this illegal activity which, according to the doctors, was killing him, and he was making me part of it. I resolved that if I ever got out from under Papa's thumb, I would never, never, never touch this damnable stuff. I saw what it did to Papa. I saw what it did to Mama. I could sense the harm it was doing to their relationship. How could a young girl, no, I was a young woman now, ever get away? When we told Mama about our plans with Nell and Belle, she was now not only nervous about the bums and degenerates, but that I would spill the beans. Flora reassured her that she would bunk with me so that if I started talking, she could choke me. Mama finally agreed, saying, I'll come out and check on you often. Off we went to make our fortunes. Accommodations were primitive. We stayed in a sharecropper's cabin. We hauled our own water from a faucet by the owner's house. We cooked our meals on an electric element that sparked furiously when we plugged it in. We warmed out bathwater in a washtub in the sun, and we worked from dawn until dusk as fast as our little fingers could pluck. The field manager was very happy with us. That went on for one day. That evening, while our wieners and beans were digesting, our plates were still in the dishpan. We hadn't worked out our who's going to do what, when, where, and how schedule, and we had all settled around the table under the only light in the cabin. Florence said, "Shall we play Parcheesi?" Belle wasn't interested, neither was Nell. They inquired about our reading habits. Dumb question. Sure, we did some reading, at school, and the funny papers. Once I went to the library and took out a book and kept it for 3 months and had to hit Papa up for the fine. That was the most talking I had done all day. This was obviously not what they meant. Without further ado, Belle went to their bunk, brought back a stack of magazines, and laid them on the table. I wasn't much interested, and began to lay out the Parcheesi board. Then I looked at Fleur, who, because of her academic inclinations, was looking at a magazine. Her eyes were as wide open as when she had glued on her false eyelashes. I picked up a magazine and glanced at the title, Torrid Romances. I opened to the first story, and suddenly, I too was academically inclined. The stack of magazines was high, so there was no waiting in line. We just dove in and read ravenously until our little eyes couldn't stay open anymore. Long forgotten were the Parcheesi board, the embroidered dish towels for our hope chest, and the dishes in the dishpan. When I paused a moment to rest my eyes and reflect, I wondered at the incongruity of the dry agent's daughters being in possession of such materials. Now that I was into education, I didn't spend much time reflecting. The next day we were late to work, quit early, and forgot to put out our bathwater. The field manager was a little sulky. On the third day, we not only started late, we overstayed our half-hour lunch period. Not because we were overeating, but because we were so exhausted that we couldn't pull ourselves up from the bunks where we had dropped. The field manager came banging on the door. "What do you think this is, a resort?" We answered back very cheekily, "You can't fool us." Mama and Dor had been coming every day, driving out into the dusty field to check and see if we were still alive, and in case we were, bring us a few delicacies from home. Mama because concerned about the dark circles under our eyes. Of course, she blamed it on the heartless field manager, which was just what he deserved, because he was getting more heartless every day. After 8 days, when it appeared we didn't have enough stamina left to pick another berry, Mama ordered us to pack. I was relieved and, frankly, eager to get back to the funny papers. We collected our money and off we went. Papa was puzzled by it all. "How is it you can goof off all day at the beach, but you can't stand a few days at the berry field?" We didn't answer that. "Didn't you get any sleep?" We didn't answer that. Papa became philosophical. "Well, you didn't make much money, but I hope you gained some experience." We didn't answer that either. I toyed with the idea of telling Dor about the magazines, but figured that she was too young. Later, however, we had an experience that did just as well. One day, Dor and I went into Papa's closet, looking for the cat. Mama had said that it was the good idea to have the cats upstairs occasionally. They caught the mice under the eaves. Papa's closet was a forbidden area, like Mama's closet off the bathroom, but we figured that, if the cat could go in there, so could we. We didn't find the cat, but we found a box, out of which fell an envelope addressed to Papa, containing a picture postcard. One look, and we were in a fit of giggles. It was a cartoon of a very fat man, a naked fat man with a very large tummy. The tummy was so large, in fact, that it hid anything we might have hoped to see. It evidently hid what he hoped to see, too, because he was glancing into a strategically angled hand mirror, which he was holding out at arm's length. In the bubble were the words, "So there you are, you little rascal." Handwritten on the back of the card were the words, "Dear Roy, I hope your beer guzzling hasn't reduced you to this." When we were able to suppress our giggles, we put the cartoon back where we had found it. We had no intention of ever taking it out again, but the temptation was too great. Every time we figured we were safe from detection, we would sneak back into the closet. We began to speculate. Who was the card from? It was signed Pat. We didn't know of any Pat. Was Pat a lady or a man? Did Papa have a friend we didn't know about? Was it a lady friend? Did Mama know about the lady friend? By now, the card was becoming threadbare. My biggest fear was that Papa might also be taking it out every day, and would notice the deterioration, Then we would get what for. Dor assured me, Papa's got other things to giggle about. One day came the big shock. We were in the closet. We dug out the envelope and shook it. Nothing came out. The postcard was gone. This was no giggling matter. We searched in vain. Our minds went around in circles. Papa came and took it, I speculated. He caught on because of what you always say. Dor had on her innocent look. What am I always saying? You're always saying, oh, there you are, you little rascal. Well, you're always saying that too. It was a fact. We used the phrase a dozen times a day. When we were looking for our books, papers, swimming caps, the funny fork in the silverware drawer, or the ants that were crawling in the oatmeal. Every time we said it, we got into a fit of giggles. When Mama called us to dinner, we were the color of a couple of beets. We didn't dare look up. Somehow, I was afraid that if I looked at Papa, he would be looking like Gray Kitty after she had caught a mouse. We were extremely polite and considerate, waiting for the axe to fall. However, it didn't. Not that night, and not the next. A very difficult time followed. We kept waiting for the Inquisition. Now, we were beset with a new problem. Flor, who had never been in on our secret, had developed a fondness for the saying. Whereas Dor and I had been careful about saying it around Papa, Flor didn't know the difference. She said it anywhere and everywhere. She would go right up to Papa, pick a bit of lint off of his lapel, and say sweetly, "Oh, there you are, you little rascal." Dor and I became so stressed that our grades slipped again.